What a blessing. Thank you, ladies, for that. We'll dismiss our children. We'll be in Esther chapter 6 tonight. Esther and the 6th chapter. I get a lot of encouragement going through this book of Esther. And you've experienced it, I'm certain, that whenever you're preparing to preach or teach or communicate something, you study it and read it in a different light than when you're just reading through. And just constantly things that I hadn't seen before or never stood out to me. And but part of that too is just the nature of a living book that we have called the Bible. But I hope that these are encouraging messages on the Wednesday night. And tonight, Esther chapter 6, it should also be an encouragement to us as we see the good hand of God working. Let's start in our first verse, and I'll let you be seated. We're going to read through as the message develops here, and but let's just go to verse number 1, and then we'll dive in. On that night, could not the king sleep? And he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles. And they were read before the king. I still hear pages turning, so I'm going to give you a moment to get there. The ladies just sang, referring to that night. And that's the way this verse, in fact, the only thing I've highlighted in my Bible on this 6th chapter is those first 3 words, on that night. I want to remind you of something very important. Things are not always what they seem. You can take that birth of Jesus Christ setting, and there were a lot of negatives about that, just looking at it from a human standpoint, a medical standpoint, a planning standpoint. Illustration, case in point, a man who was once shipwrecked, washed ashore on an uninhabited island. In the days following, he painstakingly constructed a hut out of a few things that he was able to salvage from the wreck so that he could find a little bit of safety and protection. And upon returning from an evening of lengthy search for food, he was terrified when he found that his hut had engulfed in flames. The loss of this, in light of the context of him being lost and perhaps never found, the loss of this devastated him. And he spent that night despondent, sleeping on the sand, and just tears he couldn't hold back. But he woke early the next morning. To his surprise, he saw a ship anchored off the island. A crew member stopped ashore and told him, "We saw your smoke signal and we came to rescue you." You know, what seemed to be destruction turned out to be deliverance. Such was the case with Mordecai. If you remember this story, Mordecai, he's been shipwrecked by an anti-Semitic undercurrent on an island of great injustice. And now he stands in death's shadow. Every hope that has sheltered him seemingly has gone up in smoke. The book of Esther, it paints a very dark picture. It's a bleak picture for the Jews in the Persian Empire. The king has signed their death certificate, and it's only a matter of time. And it's ticking away. A high-ranking, prominent official named Haman. Haman is a hater of the Jews. And the Jews are in his sights, and he will stop at nothing to see them annihilated. The people of God seem hopeless to stop this insane edict. All hope seems lost. But remember, things are not always what they seem. Esther chapter 6, and if you would remember, if you want to note, if you're noting anything, verses 1 through 13, it functions as the structural center of the entire book. I was trying to figure out how I put this into a graph so I could see it. And I was trying to figure out how we could show this. And it might be better if I just print it and provide it to you. But it is the central point of the structure of the book. And there's a parallel. You find that the plot, it is starting in chapter 1, especially in chapter 2. It is increasing in its climax, the plot. It thickens. And we get to chapter 6 and then it begins to decrease. And there's a parallel between the chapters. And so it's very important that we understand all of this that we're reading about leading up to chapter 6. It leads up to this point. And after chapter 6, it hinges upon what we read here tonight. The first 2 verses of the chapter are the turning verses, really, of the entire book. Notice verse 1 and verse 2. On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh. To me, it sounds like 2 dinosaurs, and my mind drifts. 2 of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And so these 2 verses are the turning point of this ship, the book of Esther. Remember back in chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. In fact, hold your place here because we see the connection. You'll want to remember this. In chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. And in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, here they're mentioned again, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai. Remember, Mordecai is the Jew, the cousin who raised Esther. Esther, who was an orphan girl, and who told it unto Esther, who is now the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hanged, these 2 that were looking to undermine or to plot to assassinate the king. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. And so now we go back to chapter 6. This is 5 years later. So chapter 2 is a key passage in the entire book. And chapter 6 is the turning point in the entire book. So we're looking at significance here tonight. All of it is, but as far as the storyline goes. Remember, this is a book about providence. The providence of God. If any chapter in the book of Esther reveals the providence of God, I believe it has to be chapter 6. Providence, it means before. We take if you look at providence, video, to see. It just means to see beforehand. Who in here is able to see beforehand? Well, that's not us, but that is our God. A part of the providence of God is the matter of timing. Providence has been said, it's the hand of God in the glove of history. And timing is a part of that. You know this verse. Many, if you've done much with soul winning, you're familiar with Proverbs 27 and verse 1. Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. What a day may bring forth. There have been certain days in our history where people got up and they planned to go about their day as things being usual. Such would have been yesterday, 1941. But it wasn't a day as usual. Another was September 11th, 2001. Thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. And this statement is truth in the Word of God, but it's also a truth which is powerfully illustrated in the life of Haman. See, God operates on schedule. God knows what He's doing, and in a 24-hour day, it is stunning, it's amazing what a day may bring forth. Once again, we can see the sovereign hand of God invisibly at work in the life of each and every one that is living at this time. But especially, we're going to see God's hand at work in the life of the king. God was working out His purposes, whether the king knew it or not. And we can see in this passage in chapter 6 several evidences of God's providence, God's hand in the glove of history. Remember, it's only hours earlier that we concluded in chapter 5, where Esther served a banquet, and Ahasuerus, the king, and Haman attended. And Haman has been setting up this huge pole, these gallows, to impale Mordecai. And that's what we ended with in chapter 5 and verse 14. So tonight, I want us to look in basically chapter 6, we're going to look at a 24-hour period. And so tonight, I've entitled the message, God does not need a lot of time. God does not need a lot of time, but He's always right on time. Notice in verses 1 through 5, we read verses 1 and 2. Let's continue with verse 3, 4, and 5. We're looking at some significant statements here. Notice in verse 3, and the king said, this is the king who hasn't been able to sleep. And the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Remember, he's reading in the Chronicles, and he reads about what Mordecai did concerning these two assassins. And so it's put into the Chronicles 5 years before that Mordecai was one who was credited for saving the king for whatever reason. Mordecai didn't get advanced, but Haman did for whatever reason. So here we are 5 years later, and the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there's nothing done for him. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was coming to the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he prepared for him. And the king's servant said unto him, behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, let him come in. This is the stuff that movies are made of, except this is real stuff. All right, notice those first three words of verse 1. On that night. That night. Just sounds rather routine. It doesn't sound like anything big time is getting ready to take place. Just a little night in the palace of the king. Just a night in the life of a man who holds the future of the Jewish people in his hand. It's just a little thing. Let me ask you, does God work in little things? Oh, He absolutely does. Again, the lady's just saying about a little night like that. It's amazing how God just takes little things, things that don't seem to be very important, but God is at work. So on that night, the hand of God slips into the hand of history. On that night, it's as if God pinpoints on that night. It's as if God says something significant and special is going to happen on a routine on that night. So let's follow the activities of this day. Let's see what takes place on that night and in this 24-hour day in the life of this wicked man named Haman? Well, we begin in verse 1 with the king's insomnia. Just when the shadows of death seem darkest, a ray of hope shines from an unexpected place. We saw in verses 1 and 2, while all were sleeping in Susa, the king was wide awake, and God kept him up for a very important reason. Don't you know that God doesn't just direct your steps, but He also directs your sleep? Amen. What's the big deal about that? Well, it's not unusual for people to not be able to sleep, especially someone who's a king. Shakespeare said, quote, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown," end of quote. King Ahasuerus was a man of great responsibility. Maybe financial pressures were keeping him awake. Maybe some worrying. Maybe he's thinking about this strange request that Esther has given to him. And this banquet doesn't seem really like a big deal, and yet God's at work. What a day, just a day may bring forth. There are times when I've not been able to sleep at night. Maybe it's due to eating too much. Maybe it's insomnia. Sometimes I think maybe it's also God trying to talk to me. So sometimes I will talk to the Lord in those hours. Sometimes I've planned some things that I hadn't thought of otherwise. I think a lot sometimes during those sleepless moments. I've prayed for you as you've come to mind, and I wonder, is that why God woke me up? But something that all of us need to understand, though you and I may not be able to sleep in the night, we have a God who's a God who never sleeps. The Bible says that our God does not sleep. Psalm 121 verses 3 and 4 says, "He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep." God's not asleep. Even when some of you are sleeping in here, He's awake and He's at work. You're just making Him work a little bit harder while you're sleeping. Lamentations 3:22 and 23. His compassions fail not. His mercies are new every morning. Why? Well, one of the reasons is because God's not been sleeping. God is working during the night. God is making special plans for us. Oh, what a day may bring forth in the life of God's people. God made sure that the king had insomnia. Why? Because there was something that the king needed to see. And now's the right time for it. And we saw in verse 1 and 2 that he had a surprising discovery. Ahasuerus wasn't at a loss for sources of entertainment. He could have brought in the band. He could have brought in the jokers. He could have brought in all kinds of things. Something that would be soft and putting him to sleep. He could have had some entertainment where he could have laughed. He could have done all kinds of things. His decision, however, was to have a book read to him. I mean, if anything's going to put you to sleep, it's to read the current events that took place 5 years ago. But that was of God. Amen. I mean, what's going to help some of you sleep than just reading some boring material? So the king ordered his staff to read from the Palace Chronicles. But in reading, he found himself suddenly alert. Why? Because he heard what we saw in chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. And so that prompted the king to ask some questions, at least two questions. And we see those in verse 3 and 4 that we read. And the first question, which is vital to the story, after reading and remembering the event with Mordecai saving his life, he says, "What's been done?" And the answer was nothing's been done for him. Let me remind us, it's often been said that God's delays, they're not His denials. Joseph was in the same situation when he was down in the prison. God's delays do not necessarily mean they are God's denials. We sometimes get impatient and we wonder why the wicked are prospering while the righteous are suffering. But God's never in a hurry. God doesn't need a lot of time, but He's always right on time. You know, God is long suffering to the wicked. And I believe that's because He wants them to repent. He's patient with His people because He wants them to receive the right reward and blessing at the right time and for the right purpose. If Mordecai was ever puzzled because the king promoted Haman but ignored him, he's going to soon find out that God had not made a mistake. Why? Because God doesn't need a lot of time, but He's always right on time. And we see the second question, and the second question is in verses 4 and 5. And as soon as the king realized that nothing had been done to honor Mordecai, he set out to make it right. And he sought advice. Ironically, he seeks advice from the person whose agenda for Mordecai was radically different than the king's. And we find in verse 4 the timely arrival of Haman coming in. Now, it's possible that Haman's been up all night enjoying the supervision of the construction of the gallows on which he plans to hang Mordecai. It's very early in the morning, but Haman wants to get in to see the king so that he could get permission as soon as possible for the execution. So he's entering in to see the king. Some may call it poetic justice. I call it God's providence. Paul Harvey illustrated this point when he told about a man named Gary Tyndall who was charged with robbery. He said, while standing in the California courtroom of Judge Armando Rodriguez, Tyndall asked permission to go to the bathroom. He was escorted upstairs to the bathroom and the door was guarded while he was inside. But Tyndall determined to escape. So he climbed up the plumbing, he opened a panel in the ceiling, and he started slithering through the crawl space heading south. He traveled some 30 feet when the ceiling panels broke under him, and he dropped to the floor right back in front of Judge Rodriguez's courtroom. God doesn't need a lot of time. God's always right on time. The king's servant picked out a very special book. It wasn't special then, but it was significant. And it told about Mordecai's good deeds and read that section to the king. And that is the unmistakable hand of God at work. Let me ask you, can you see the unmistakable providential hand of God at work in your life? If you don't see it, if you're not noticing it, rest assured, He's working. We get to verse number 6, and verse 6 through 11, we find, well, things take a turn. They take a turn for Haman. The king asked Haman a very important question. Notice in verse 6. So you got the picture, right? Haman's coming in because of this and this law that went into effect that all the Jews will be executed. And they had I believe a year's, what the Bible tells us, before this is carried out. And Mordecai has worked this to happen. He's caused this to happen. And so they're running out of time. The clock is ticking. And we find Mordecai, he's heading in. He's already worked on this. He's going in to get the king's permission to execute, Haman is going in to get permission to execute Mordecai. And what is it about Mordecai that Haman has hated? Well, Haman wouldn't bow to him. I said it the other way. I keep saying it the other way. Mordecai wouldn't bow to Haman. He wouldn't honor him. And so it disturbs Haman so much that he doesn't want to just kill Mordecai, but he wants to kill his people, the people of God. And so the king now, he's hearing about Mordecai. Why didn't something happen to Mordecai? Why didn't we honor him? That was 5 years ago. Something should be done. We need to do something. And he wants to try to figure out, well, what can we do for Mordecai at this point? Who's standing nearby? Who's outside the door? And they said, well, it's Haman. Well, we'll bring Haman in. And so notice verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And so Haman is thinking, boy, did I time this right. Because that's what Haman has been wanting. Remember in chapter 5, he went and told his wife and family, you wouldn't believe, out of all the people, I was invited to a banquet by the king's wife. It was just me and the king, nobody else. And so here he is, and the king's going to ask him, what would you do? What do you recommend for somebody that the king wants to honor? What can be done? Don't you see how God is at work? He's righting the wrongs. He's making things straight. God's been keeping score. God's at work. It's clear to see. So Haman answers the king because Haman's thinking, I want to tell the king exactly what I would want. Because he's thinking the king wants to honor him. Who wouldn't want to honor Haman? And so he tells the king, here's what I think you should do. Verse 7, and Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, well, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let his apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Well, then to Haman's surprise, the king says, hurry, get her done. Notice in verse 10, the king said to Haman, make haste, take the apparel and the horse as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. Note this too, in verse number 10. Mordecai refers to him as the Jew. You get the impression that the king completely forgot that he had permitted Haman to issue an edict to destroy the Jews. Now let's read verse number 11 as this beautiful scene unfolds. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. I want to tell you, there could not be two more contrasting characters than these two, and to be placed alongside one another. You have proud and self-centered Haman. You have the humble and purposed Mordecai. The very man wanting to hang Mordecai, now he wants to hang him because Mordecai wouldn't honor him, and now Haman has to honor the man that he wants to put to death. I want to say it's amazing at times how God works. Let me remind you, God is your provider. God is your protector. He can take the darkest situations you face and He can turn them around for His glory and His honor. When all of hope seems lost, it's not, if you're on God's side. Now, in verses 12 through 14, as we close this out, we see Haman. he gets some very unwelcomed and some unimaginable news. Let's follow Haman for a bit and see what happens. In verse number 12. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate. But Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. First, Haman has to go out to the king's gate. He gets Mordecai. He brings him into the palace. He has to dress Mordecai in the king's robes. After putting Mordecai on the king's horse, Haman had to lead him throughout the city, up and down the streets, proclaiming in essence, this is the man whom the king delights to honor. Over and over, announcing. And after he'd visited all the city streets, Haman had to lead the horse back to the palace, remove the royal garments that Mordecai had worn, and send him back to his palace at the city gate, or rather to his place at the city gate. And you can't help but to see the irony in all of this. For almost a whole day, Haman was the servant of Mordecai, commanding the people, you bow down, you honor him. The thing Mordecai would not do for Haman, bow down, Haman is telling others, you do this for Mordecai. Well, how did all this pageantry and prominence affect Mordecai? Well, when it was over, he just simply returned back to his place and at the gate, and he continued to serve the king. Listen, applause doesn't change genuine, humble people because their values are deeper than that. God can trust his blessings with the humble because they seek to honor the Lord. Now, what was Haman's reaction? Well, it was quite different, for he's humiliated. He went home as soon as possible. His head was covered. He pretended as though he's grieving for the dead, but that's not what he was doing. He just was humiliated. Haman, once proud and arrogant, now realizes the tables are turned. Why? Don't forget, things are not always what they seem. Not only that, but his wife and friends, they realize what's happening as well. And so they basically say to him in verse 13, you've got some bad luck. How's that for an encouraging conversation with a loved one? They're telling him, you're not going to win. You're going to fail. The warning from Haman's wife and the wise men, it kind of reminds me of some of the jokes or even the sayings that you may get from somebody, like the doctor who told his patient, I have some bad news and I have some worse news. The patient said, okay, let's have it. The doctor said, the bad news is you only have 24 hours to live. The patient said, well, I can't imagine anything being worse than that. And the doctor said, well, I forgot to tell you yesterday. That's where Haman is. But remember, God and his gospel, it always wins. No matter how bad things look in the meantime. I was going to have us sing tonight, but since Brother Autry had to learn a new song, I thought I'd give him a break. But we do have this song. I think we may have sung it on Sunday. Did we sing I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day? Did we do that on Sunday? You can't remember Sunday, can you? But we do have it coming on a Sunday. But I marked it here. I want you to see this. And look at 152. I think we may have done this, Brother Autry. But if not, we do have it coming up on a Sunday. I want you to see Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote these words. And we miss so often, and many of our songs, we miss that many who wrote these songs, again, the difference between the writers in a lot of our books and our hymnals, they were theologians. They were people who walked with God. And the ones who are writing much of our music today that the churches are exercising are musicians. And what we need is some musicians who become theologians, who walk with God. But notice the song. We know this song. I heard the bells on Christmas Day. Their old familiar carols play. But notice, I want you to see verse number 4. Yet pealed the bells more loud and deep. Notice the phrase. I love this. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote this after his son was severely wounded during the Civil War, and his wife also having died. And I love the reminder, and I think we need to be reminded, our God is not dead. Neither does he sleep, no matter how bad things look. We need to remember that even when God seems absent, he's not. In sickness or health, in poverty or prosperity, in promotion or demotion, in the darkest night or in the brightest day, he's there. He's watching. He's waiting. He's working. During the arrest, you can close your Bibles and look this way. During the arrest and trial and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, things were not as they seemed. It seemed as if Jesus was on his way to defeat. In reality, he was on his way to victory. All appeared dark and hopeless when the cross was engulfed in darkness. But on that first Easter morning, hope dawned triumphantly to herald a risen Savior. Up from the grave he arose. When all seemed lost for the world enslaved to sin, it wasn't, for we just had one and the only one who could conquer sin, death, and hell. When no one seemed to notice Christ's agony on the cross, his Father did. Justice triumphed in the end. And it's important to understand that if we live our lives by the way things appear, we're living by sight rather than by faith. And that's not how the disciple of God is to ever live. When you don't see God at work, he is. Amen. He is. God kept the king awake. God led him to read the record about Mordecai. And God had Haman arrive at just the right time. All of that happened behind the scenes. So Esther, Mordecai, and the Jews did not know about it. Let me remind you again. Romans 8:28. It is a promise that God is working on your behalf. So trust him. Treat him as though he's God. Amen. Remember the story of Esther. Cling to the promise that things are not always as they seem. God doesn't need a lot of time. Because he's God, he's always right on time. Amen. Let's stand together, please.